much to say, is the grand old man of raptors in Wyoming, Bob Oakleaf. We had to pull him out of retirement to come and do this. He went to Colorado State as an undergrad, University of Nevada, Reno, for his master's on sage grouse. Is that correct, Bob? Started Wyoming Game and Fish 1977. I asked him, did you start off as the head of non-game right off the bat? He says, well, I was only one. And anyways, he headed that up all those years. First time I met him was over 20 years ago, Rollins State Chapter of the Wildlife Society meetings, and at the end he said, geez, I missed your talk, I really wanted to hear it, but the beer was just going down so good at the bar, I just stayed there. So now it's my turn to listen to Bob talk. He doesn't have a PowerPoint, probably blessedly relief to most of us, but the status of golden eagles in Wyoming with emphasis on Greater Yellowstone. Bob Oakleaf.
Well, thanks, Doug. Yeah, as Doug mentioned, I do not have a PowerPoint. I'm going to try something a little different. I also am not going to present a lot of data either. What I'm going to do is focus on some conclusions that I came up with based upon 6 or 7 studies on golden eagles that we've had in Wyoming. And I see some of my friends cheering about the PowerPoint. But anyway, so if you're interested in the data and relevant to the conclusions I spit out, I do have a annual report that's available on the Game and Fish Internet. It's readily available, and you can go to that. It was in the 2014 non-game annual report. There's also a couple of studies that, well, several of them that have received publications from peer reviews, portions of them anyway. The first one that comes to mind was a study that I was only minimally involved in, and that was Bob Phillips with the Fish and Wildlife Service conducted fixed-wing inventories for golden eagles at, I believe it was 12 different study areas around the state, and it was primarily involved with potential cold. And this was back in the early 80s and late 70s. And he published his estimate based on extrapolation of those studies in the Wildlife Society Bulletin. His estimate of statewide numbers of golden eagles in Wyoming was 4,000 nesting pairs during those years. Recently, I was involved with a study with the Rocky Mountain Research Station out in Zulu. And John Squires and Cretia Olson and Zach Wallace, to name a few that I worked with. And we published an estimate on golden eagles. It is based upon our approach of selecting 99 random transects in lowland habitats in Wyoming. And I say random townships. The selection was stratified by Bailey's ecoregions and also by energy development levels. We have them broken out into high, low, and medium energy townships, and we transected these townships, obtained the density with a couple of different approaches, and then extrapolated that across the state. And we came up with 1,400 nesting pairs in Wyoming statewide. And I'd like to state that both those studies had their biases. Phillips' biases, of course, was much greater than the one that we did. But his biases were tended to overinflate the nesting numbers. Our biases tended to underestimate the numbers. And if we have time, we can talk about that later. But so this looks like a substantial reduction, but I've also been involved in several other studies around the state, Powder River Basin, Medicine Bowl, Arlington area, an area north evaluating the numbers, it became pretty obvious that what was happening was studies and efforts to inventory golden eagles prior to 1993, give or take a year, came up with relatively high numbers, and people were impressed of nesting golden eagles. After 1994, any of the studies were about 50% of what they had previously documented. And of course, then most of the studies continued through the 90s and until recently at various levels of intensity, and the golden eagle nesting population did not change. Of course, you've heard the importance of prey, and I did quite a bit of research, quite a bit of looking at the prey situation in Wyoming, and you know, you can't have enough prey really. The strongest data set that we have is the Hunter Harvest survey that Chuck mentioned. Brad Fetty published on this data set. This paper came out, I think, about 2010 or something like that. But only went up until 2007. And he found that cocktails were cycling on an 8-year cycle, 2 years low, 2 years high. His paper came out, and that paradigm fell apart. They went into a low in 2007 and only recently started coming back. So I don't know where that leads. But I also looked at the jackrabbit data that were available, and there are several data sets, but the best data set is associated with coal mines that are running roadside transects, and there are 14 mines that had fairly good data sets. And it became obvious, several did, but the most important factors were that jackrabbits did not correlate with cocktails. That said, in 1993, jackrabbit numbers crashed, and that also was the low of cocktails in the 30 years that we've been monitoring. So, jackrabbit numbers have not recovered. We're starting to see some recently in the last year or two, but they aren't anywhere near they were. And prior to that, in 1978, the numbers were unbelievable, just generally speaking, from what I saw. And they fluctuated up until 93 when they crashed. Give me a quantified idea of how significant that crash was. We were doing 9 roadside surveys for black-footed ferrets in Shirley Basin, which is part of that wind energy area in Edisonville, Arlington, that I mentioned, where we study nesting raptors. But anyway, those roadside transects, looking for ferrets, but they're 15 kilometers long, and typically in 1992 anyway, I had one transect that I particularly liked because it had a lot of ferrets on it. But I counted over 100 jackrabbits, white-tailed jackrabbits, in the first 15-kilometer sweep. And that's sort of a significant number. In 1994, I ran the same transect, and there was 0 jackrabbits. Honest to God, 0 jackrabbits. And that situation was repeated on nearly 20 roadside transects in Shirley Basin in 94. Also, we did it in, or I had someone count the jackrabbits in 2013 on the exact same roadside transect. And she counted 1 plus 3 cocktails. And, you know, those are the kind of numbers we're dealing with across Wyoming. And so it's no wonder that golden eagles are lower than they were in the 70s and 80s currently, because the jackrabbits just have not come back. As Chuck mentioned, we don't have ground squirrels. The Richardson ground squirrels are great prey for golden eagles. They're big. They are the biggest ground squirrel, I think. Almost the size of the white-tailed prairie dog. Excellent prey for golden they don't quite, the range doesn't extend. Well, anyway, we could talk about prey a lot more, but it is important. I found moving on, there was a lot of drumbeats as far as the status of golden eagles. A lot of interest groups were concerned that they were in trouble. And so in 2013, I reflew cliffs in the greater Yellowstone area that had flown 1978 through 1984, and flew over 800 kilometers of cliffs looking for golden eagles. Yeah, in the early years, I was looking for peregrine falcons and following up on reintroduction. But we were very interested in golden eagles, so we could not develop a peregrine falcon reintroduction program without knowing where the eagles were and where our problems were going to be. And what we found was in 2013 there was as many nesting pairs of golden eagles in the greater Yellowstone area, and also the Big Horn Mountains, as there was during 1978 through 84. And of course the reason for this is the alternate prey, and especially yellow-bellied marmots. It doesn't take very many days of watching golden eagles to know that they are selectively hunting for marmots, just like back in the 70s, she knew that they were looking for jackrabbits. But at any rate, we also followed up on ground surveys that when we were collecting eagle data, when we were looking for returning peregrines from the lease sites. We also included Yellowstone Park and Grand Teton Park in the early 80s. And we certainly don't have as good of information as what's been in the last couple of years. But in those two parks and repeat ground surveys, the results are essentially the same based upon occupied nests. And it appears that golden eagles has either remained stable or increased in recent years. And the work that Yellowstone is doing is incredibly interesting to me. I knew of 5 nesting pairs of golden eagles. And so it looks like they've expanded, increased greatly in Yellowstone based on their data. Maybe they have, I'm not sure, but I think it's a combination of I didn't really conduct helicopter surveys in Yellowstone except for the thoroughfare area. But that's mostly ground surveys. We did not cover the northern range like eagles, that's for sure. But I do know that some of those areas, those eagles were not there. Some of your sites were not there. It'd be helpful if we had a clock. 2 minutes or so. Anyway, so I want to encourage the monitoring and research in the greater Yellowstone area to continue. It's incredibly interesting. It's valuable. Particularly interesting is this marmot situation. We don't know why the jackrabbits disappeared. There are places in North America where marmots have disappeared. And this is a recent occurrence and people don't know what the story is with that. Continue the food habit study. And to me, this occupancy rates and production indices, it varies extremely from one site to the next, and it'd be interesting to find out. Even though the densities, even though the total numbers don't vary, even though they stay exactly the same, the occupancy rates may be down as low as 30%, but the total number of pairs. So I'm not sure what these indices mean. We're learning a lot from Denali, what they mean, and there's some changes going on with inventory techniques, classifying them. But certainly continuing the research in Yellowstone Park and Grand Teton, or at least will be very helpful to understand.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. Okay, we kind of held questions to this moment now, so if the speakers could to this table. We have until about 3:30, 13, 14 minutes to have a discussion about the talks that you guys heard. I think if there's any questions, we'll start right with that. If not, the speakers may expand on some of the topics they mentioned. I want to personally thank all the speakers. We really are excited